seen under the book?
Nothing I can think of off the top of my head. It seems like kind of an application of the theoretical framework which he has like established in his previous books. It's just kind of put to work with the current economic crisis. So yeah, that's all I have to say about that, I think.
Yeah. So is there a similar theoretical framework as in the...
Yeah, he's always seems to be really interested in the different crises which are inherent in capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
And, also the expansive nature of capitalism, how it just has to keep growing and growing. And at this rate, I think he points out the statistics, the amount that markets need to grow to remain stable. And it's quite high. So yeah, those are kind of themes that are throughout most of his books.
It's true, yeah. That is probably the major driving force that he sees in the capitalist system, that it must maintain
3% growth is what
3% growth rate in order to avoid crises. I was trying to figure out where did he get that number from.
Yeah.
And the only thing I could find is that he says that's what economists and people in financial papers say, which seemed to me a bit weak. I mean, the thesis, of course, is included in Marx's theory of capital accumulation, and that you get eventually you reach points of development where there are no immediate opportunities for profitable investment of the surplus, and so I guess it's important what he says, and interesting that basically anybody who says, well, maybe we can have a steady state economy down the road, that is when we have gotten our shop in order as far as ecology is concerned. He would say, and say this on the basis of a Marxist analysis of capitalism, that no, there's no growth. You cannot have no growth capitalism. And I think the same would, in fact, be said by economists of the neoclassical and neoliberal kind. I think they would agree that this is so. Uncover the systemic character of capital flow. And that sounds very promising. It's not just capital flows, which are analyzed all the time by economists, but he wants to relate it to a deeper political, economic system and systems in the world. Yeah, he gives an overview, of which there are lots by now, about the disruption, the crisis of 2008, which I think is fine. In the second chapter, which is entitled Capital Assembled, he says that capital is not a thing, but a process. I think that is truly a very important point. It's not just assets that sit there and that you can put a value on. That's not the important thing, but it's the flow of capital, the process in which these assets are a part, which determines how much they're worth and what happens with them. He also says that the crisis devalues a lot of capital assets. And I mean, that seems to be one way in which you can deal with the excessive surplus problem. You just devalue. You have apparently $500 trillion of asset devaluation occurred as a result of this most recent crisis. That's pretty good. That's 10 times the global output annually. So maybe these crises take care of it. this basic tension that I see in his work. On the one hand, he wants to be quite open as far as non-economic, non-strictly material factors are concerned that may play an important role in social change. He wants to recognize that. Very much we'll see when we look at his framework that he reveals only later in chapter 5. On the other hand, however, he seems very traditional or orthodox in his Marxism, in how he sometimes deals with factors of this kind. And I found that particularly visible and striking when he talked about race, ethnicity, gender, language, religious beliefs, which would be such things, that are that in a more orthodox Marxist view, you would take largely as expressions of what goes on in the social relations of production. Largely. Don't have to be too mechanistic about it, but on the whole, yes. And I think the way he uses it here bears that out. Because he says race, ethnicity, gender, language, religious beliefs become, quote, tools, or a tool through which capitalists manage labor supplies. You can interpret this in different ways, but it does sound like why they matter is because they become a tool in the management of labor. This is the kind of, I think, implicit reductionism that tends to be there in a lot of Marxist work. But he doesn't, this is not a consistent position he takes. He has quite a range of takes on it. Yeah. He says the capital, it's on page 66, the capital-labor relation always plays a major role in dynamics of capitalism. Well, yes. Thank you for that. And here's another sort of commonplace. These days, capital is too powerful. Okay. So, sometimes the things that he states are so obvious that why, and he does have this tendency to have this is true and it makes sense, these statements, but they're sort of common knowledge. Then he has statements that sound pretty profound, but they're actually tautologies. Leaving aside the ideological fight over state planning versus market, what this all means is that the continuity of capital flow in a world of increasingly complicated social divisions of labor rests upon the existence of adequate institutional arrangements that facilitate the continuity of that flow across space and time. Where those arrangements are defective or do not exist, capital will encounter serious barriers. That is empty of information. It just says that capital needs certain institutional arrangements. It doesn't say what they are. They have to be adequate. So that doesn't tell you anything ahead of time. Then he says, well, if they're not there, then capital has problems. Maybe we move on to his model. I don't know why he makes readers wait until chapter 5 into the book, until he finally says, okay, here's my model that I use to resolve the enigma of capital. I don't really see how the other stuff is necessary as preparation, And why it wouldn't be helpful to have that in hand ahead of time. It's on pages 122 to 23. It starts. He calls his model of the social world is a model of activity spheres embedded in a set of institutional arrangements, such as private property rights and market contracts, and administrative structures, the state, and other local multinational arrangements. Okay, these institutions also evolve on their own account, rather than on account of what. It's not quite clear. They also evolve on their own account, even as they find themselves forced to adapt to crisis conditions. Okay. So they have their own dynamic. They're not just victims of economic forces that push them into different places. Then another basic assumption is that people act on their expectations, their beliefs, and their understandings of the world. Now, this sounds so pedestrian, that you could probably get away with that in an intro to sociology class. But what makes it nevertheless noteworthy for him? Why does he feel he needs to put that in the first place? And the reason is that Marxists aren't really expected to do analyses at that level. Right? Because expectations, beliefs, and understandings of people in general are formed in the ideological superstructure of society, and basically, they reflect that. There's no, and so for him to put that in signals, oh no, I don't share that. I think otherwise it makes no sense. Tell me someone who would say people don't act on their expectations, beliefs, and their understandings of the world. Because then he says social systems depend on trust in experts, adequate knowledge and information on the part of those making decisions. Acceptance as to reasonable social arrangements or hierarchies or egalitarianism, as well as constructions of ethical and moral standards, which is the activity sphere. Culture, norms, and belief systems, that is, religious and political ideologies, are powerfully present but do not exist independently of social relations, production and consumption possibilities, and dominant technologies. Now he's backpedaling a bit. He's saying, well, of course not independent now that we've given them, have given them some independence. The contested interrelations between the evolving technical and social requirements for capital accumulation and the knowledge structures and cultural norms and beliefs consistent with the endless accumulation have all played a critical role in capitalism's evolution. Okay. For purposes of simplification, I will collect together all of these last elements under the rubric of mental conceptions of the world. So that's all this stuff really is one sphere, the mental sphere, mental conception of the world. So that's one. Here are the others then. The seven basic activity spheres that make up his framework. Technologies and organizational forms, that's one. Social relations, two. Institutional and administrative arrangements, Okay, and we can think of the simple base superstructure model and see is that what it is, or is there more? And so far, it follows that the technologies are fundamental. On their basis, social relations emerge. On top of those are institutional and administrative arrangements. Okay. Then he has a special one for production and labor processes. Okay, that fits in. Then there's relations to nature. And the sixth one is the reproduction of daily life and of the species. And the seventh, mental conceptions of the world. Well, I think those are not, as categories, they're vague, and, unless he now moves on and really substantiates them and shows how to handle them, I think they're pretty empty. He has another paragraph where he basically restates it. And he says at the bottom of 123, the complex flows of influence that move between the spheres, are perpetually reshaping all of them. What is that? No. So you have something that's moving, and as it's moving, it's reshaping the different, say there's your 7 stations. The train goes through 7 stations, and it's constantly being reshaped as it is shaping what's going on in the train, probably. Furthermore, these interactions are not necessarily harmonious. Indeed, we can reconceptualize crisis formation in terms of the tensions and antagonisms that arise between the different activity spheres, as, for example, new technologies play against the desire for new configurations in social relations or disrupt the organization of existing labor processes. Now, remember, with the help of this, he wants to analyze, and more than analyze, he wants to uncover how capital flows in capitalist systems. It's a big agenda, and that's a pretty flimsy framework because it's even, these headings are, they could imply a ton of things or not. So rather than now going through them systematically and coming up with examples of goes to an anecdote, where some architects liked his framework. This I found also interesting. So this framework of 7 activity spheres, he says on page 126, does not originate with me, however. It derives from elaboration upon a footnote in chapter 15 of Capital. Well, that's very good. It is securely fastened in the realm of Marxist thinking, even if not in some overall scheme, but in a particular footnote. Who gets the feeling we're doing a bit of Bible exegesis here? But I guess there Marx, not probably knowing what he was doing, provided this key to uncovering the capital flow. And then he went off and wrote Capital 2 and Capital 3, got worse and worse. He should have stopped right here. Okay. in chapter 6, chapter 6 is called The Geography of It All. And there he makes the claim that both in Marxist theorizing, but also in mainstream economics, the significance of rent and land values have been underestimated. That they should be seen as new primary analytical categories, whereby political economy integrates geography, space, and the relation to nature into the understanding of capitalism. Now, that sounds good in principle. But in practice, I was not really convinced that a powerful new insight had been presented. He calls this the geography of the second nature around us, meaning that there is no primary original nature anywhere on the planet. Everything, as we well know, as every kid knows probably, is affected by industrial activity, whether the Arctic or really any place in some way or another. He says the power of land, on page 182, the power of land and resource owners has been much underestimated, as has the role of land and resource asset values and rents in relation to the overall circulation and accumulation of capital. This arena of activity counts for as much as 40% of economic activity in many of the advanced capitalist countries. Okay, well, I have no way of checking, and that leads me to another, what I think is a serious criticism of a scholarly